So the second movie in the Fast and Furious franchise is 2003's Too Fast, Too Furious. This is the only Fast and Furious movie that I've actually seen in theaters, and I didn't even see the whole movie. And I know what you're thinking, damn, like you missed out on the IMAX experience of the other ones. Yeah, I did. I know it's some you can't watch everything, unfortunately, especially when I was younger and more broke. But you know what I'm saying? When I actually didn't have any money. But I did go see this movie, and it's funny. I went to go see it with this girl I was talking to at the time, and I only saw like the second half of the movie the first time I saw it. So later on, obviously, I went back and watched it, and then later on after that, I went back and watched it again for this series. So this movie's directed by John Singleton. Now, John Singleton is a great filmmaker. His most famous movie, I would say, is probably Boys in the Hood. And I love Boys in the Hood. So this kind of reminds me, and as we go through these movies, we're going to go through all the Fast movies on this series. It really reminds me, and it really sort of, I guess, puts into perspective how many great filmmakers have worked on Fast movies. Justin Lin would be carrying the franchise for a while. We also have people like James Wan coming in. Tons. F. Gary Gray did one. Like a lot of great filmmakers have done these films. But prior to this movie coming out, I mentioned Boys in the Hood, obviously Poetic Justice, Higher Learning, and right before this one was Baby Boy. And Baby Boy was a really fun hood movie. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I remember enjoying it, starring Tyrese and Snoop Dogg. And of course, Tyrese enters the Too Fast, Too Furious franchise in this film as Roman Pierce. He would, of course, come back later. Paul Walker returns to reprise his role as Brian O'Connor. And once again, this puts into perspective, once again, that this franchise was originally a Paul Walker-driven franchise. Vin Diesel became the main character right around the time of 4 and 5, but the first two are all about Brian. The camera focuses on him. Vin Diesel's like the secondary character. Toretto's like the second co-star, but really, Paul Walker was the star. However, in later movies, Paul Walker would kind of become the co-star and Dominic Toretto would become the star. So here, Paul Walker continues to play Brian O'Connor, and he's on a whole new story. He has left LAPD. He's not a cop anymore, and this movie takes place in Miami. Now, Miami was a big city when it comes to the street racing scene. Now, I've never actually seen a street race for myself in Miami, but people talk. And going to Miami is kind of a homecoming for me because I used to live in Miami. Not only did I live in Miami, but I'm also a Cuban who lived in Miami. And as you know, Miami's the biggest city in Cuba. That's a joke that we used to always make. It's a huge Cuban town. And speaking of Cubans, one of my people is in this film, the delicious creature. And yes, I'm going to call her that. And I know someone in the comments is going to be like, oh, how could you say that? A snowflake. No, dude, she's gorgeous. I'm talking about Eva Mendes. She's in this movie as Monica Fuentes. She is a customs agent working undercover, but you don't find that out right away. And she acts as the love interest for this movie. And man, does she look good. She has a genuinely pretty face. Now, the story of this movie, once again, like I mentioned, takes us over to Miami, where Brian meets up with Roman Pierce, who really isn't too happy with him because he knows that they have a history. Because, Brian became a cop, and because of that, it wound up being an issue for Roman, who did some time. So in some way, Roman is kind of like the Vin Diesel of this story, right? Of this movie. Now, when it comes over to the villain side and the plot kind of goes into that, just like in the first movie, they are going undercover to investigate this drug lord by the name of Verone. Now, this drug lord acts as the villain of the film, but like in the first movie, Brian has to infiltrate that and pretend to be, negotiating with them or whatever, pretend to be, his, a part of the team, in other words, to try and figure out just what's going on to put this guy behind bars. Now, when it comes to this movie, there's a couple of scenes in this movie that I just thought were not only awesome, but hilarious. Now, when it comes to, and we're going to get to that in a minute, this film is such a period piece, like in the history of pop culture, just like how the first movie was. This movie came out in 2003, and the soundtrack of this movie is 2003 music. I mean, you've got freaking Ludacris, who's in this movie, by the way, and he's not the only rapper. Jin is in this movie as well, and I thought it was funny because, and he plays a character named Jimmy. Jin, close enough. And it's funny because you've got Tyrese, Ludacris, and Jin, who are really known for their music, being actors in this film. But when it comes to the soundtrack, obviously Ludacris has like the big song of the movie. And Ludacris would also become a recurring character. Even though when you watch this movie, it doesn't really feel like he's going to come back. You know, he feels like somebody who's just made for this film. Act a Fool was like the big song from the soundtrack. And on top of that, you also got Trick Daddy, who is from Miami. He's got a song on the soundtrack. Tyrese, of course, has a song on the soundtrack. 8 Ball from 8 Ball and MJG, Chingy. Really a lot of the artists that were big in the commercial space during this time are on here. Joe Budden with Pump It Up. You know, a lot of big artists of the time are on here. It just feels like that time period. I mean, I remember the early 2000s very, very well. And really it's because I used to burn CDs when I was in high school. Like, you know, burn mix CDs for people. And I would oftentimes burn music from these artists. So this movie really resonates with me as far as nostalgia for that time period. But unlike the sequels, this movie's much more of a cop movie than the first movie, I would say. But it's also, like, it is an espionage film. There are heist elements, but at this point, they're nowhere near the over-the-topness of the sequels like 5 and 6 and whatnot. When it comes to putting this movie into perspective, this movie has a couple of big stunts, including the big finale, which is the car launching onto the yacht. Like, for 2003, for it being the second Fast movie, like, that was a big stunt. Like, that was a huge stunt for the time. And little would we know back in 2003 that this franchise would take those stunts so far over the top that it got ridiculous. It got totally ridiculous. But, you know, in these days, it was a big deal. And it's funny because, you know, F. Gary Gray, the way he makes his movies is he creates these interesting characters. He does put a lot of comedy into the films. And he does put 1 or 2 big action sequences, but they're spread out. So this movie really sort of began the transition from it being a street racing tribute, you know, a street racing focused film, to it being more of a heist, over the top, you know, ridiculous movie. This began that for the Fast franchise. Now with Tokyo Drift, it was kind of back to basics again in a way, but this was the sort of the appetizer. This is the appetizer before the absolute absurdity that would be the sequels. But it's still mostly grounded. It's still mostly centered. Besides that, one of the cast members that really popped me was seeing James Remar. He plays one of the cops in the movie. James Remar has been in a lot of movies, but the first time I remember seeing him and remembering him was he played Raiden in Mortal Kombat Annihilation. Think about how I'm gonna blow y'all's mind. Mortal Kombat Annihilation, one of the worst movies ever made, easily, right? Easily terrible. I saw Mortal Kombat Annihilation in theaters, and I didn't see any of the Fast movies after this one in theaters. What does that tell you about how bad my priorities were? Now, I will say this. Mortal Kombat Annihilation, when the trailers were coming out, I didn't know it sucked. There was no YouTube back then. I was 12 years old or whatever. I was a kid. I had no idea that movie was going to be that bad. And the first Mortal Kombat movie is still a good film if you ask me. But I remember James Remar from that movie. Like that, for some reason, every time that I see him in any other movie, even if it came out before, even if it's like Miracle on 34th Street, or like he's in Dexter and he's in Gotham, it's always gonna be Raiden from Mortal Kombat Annihilation, bro. That's how much that movie imprinted on me. He was in The Warriors too. Remember, Warriors come like that. Why am I talking so much about this actor and how much I dislike Mortal Kombat Annihilation? Like that hits home right there about this. That hits home. That's powerful. But anyways, this movie is probably okay, when it comes to ranking them, I would rank this one slightly below the first one. I think the first Fast and Furious might have that sort of first movie energy that, a sequel can't really follow up with. I'm not saying this is a bad movie. This one's a bit more cartoony, and there are some parts that kind of drag. So I will say that the Fast and the Furious, the first one, is better than this one, but by no means is this like a terrible movie. I've seen some people say you can skip this one, and maybe you can. I don't really remember its impact other than introducing, Tyrese and Ludacris to the franchise. Don't really remember what its impact is as far as future movies go. I guess maybe you could skip it, but I'm not going to because it's not really like a waste of time. I did mention some parts are skippable, but the chemistry between Paul Walker and Tyrese, I really enjoyed it. And everybody does a good job in the movie. It's definitely a movie from that time period. The color palette, the music, like it feels like if you were around back then and I play like 5 to 10 seconds of any scene from this movie, you're going to be like, that came out in the early 2000s. You're just going to know because that's how those movies looked back then. And not just the movies, also music videos, everything. The rappers of that time period. Ludacris was red hot back then when it came to dropping singles. He had a hell of a career when you think about it. But, it's definitely an F. Gary Gray movie in the sense of it feels like Baby Boy, except with a bigger budget. And it's a much less smaller film. It's a bigger film in every possible way. It's an action movie. And a lot of these directors kind of stretch their legs out with the Fast and Furious franchise. And they kind of sort of on-the-job training on how to do big blockbuster action stunt movies. Let's not forget that James Wan did Furious 7 and then moved on to do other bigger films after that, like Aquaman. I think Aquaman was after, right? I don't really remember. I don't remember. We'll get to that when we get to that. But my favorite scene of the film has to be the part where, and it's so unrealistic, when Tyrese does the ejection seat stunt and the dude in the passenger seat flies out of the movie, or flies out of the car, I mean. If you're going at those speeds and you get ejected from your seat, you're dead. You are going to die. The ground will tear up your skin. You're either going to die or you're going to be severely injured. So that's the beginning of this franchise becoming a bit of a cartoon show. It kind of became, a little unrealistic starting here. I don't think it was offensively bad, but this is the beginning of what the Fast movies would become. So the next one on the docket is Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift. Now, I'm sure some of you have asked, or you're wondering, are we going to be doing these in chronological order or in release order? We're doing it in release order. I know that Fast and Furious is the actual next one in chronological order, but we're doing release order because I just want to do it that way. I want to sort of redo how the movies were when they came out, and that's how we're going to do it. Obviously, Fast and Furious 3 takes place right at the end of, I think, Fast 6, right around there. They happen at the same time. So I just remember it. It's not hard. I won't get confused. I just remember that. So next review will be on Tokyo Drift. Anyways, leave your memories on this movie down below as we continue our look back at the Fast movies. Take care. Catch you in the next one.